Well, hello. I'm going to talk about Martin Bell, who was born in 1916 and died in 1978. So he was only just 62 when he died. Um, and I was going to call a talk, "Oh Splendid and Disreputable Father," which is in fact a line out of one of his poems, Ode to Groucho. Groucho as in the Marx Brothers, which gives you some kind of idea what sort of man and what sort of poet he was. I went to art school, and Martin Bell, who had finished being what they call a Gregory Fellow, was doing one afternoon a week at the art school under the broad heading of complementary studies and offering poetry. And since I was working at a very, very early sort of level as a poet, I chose to go to Martin's classes. I hadn't actually heard of Martin, but then that was true. There's an awful lot I hadn't heard of. On the other hand, I kind of knew something about French poets of the 20th century and some earlier ones. I mean, I myself did sciences at A-levels, not English. And as I said, this was an art school, not a university. So I wasn't expected to have any great historical knowledge. Martin Bell was an extraordinary character. He was very, very kind to me. He took note of my poetry. He read my poetry. He chose it for anthologies and then recommended me to another poet in London, Peter Porter, when I left the art school. It was fascinating about Martin because he wrote basically just one book, and it was called, strangely enough, Collected Poems, a book which he gave me a little time later. And it is a book which is unlike any other book that I have known, any that I knew at the time. In fact, not much like anything I know now. So I thought he had a kind of genuinely original and unique voice. But it's a voice that kind of got lost because of his death in 1978 and because there was just one book. Although it was a book that was very highly praised at the time, he seems to have faded a little bit. And I think he needs and deserves refinding. He deserves rereading, because he would spice your reading somewhat in a way that, well, it is different from contemporary, it is different from his own time. His best poems are wonderful, subversive, clowning performances, full of energy. Here's the end section from his most anthologized poem, Winter Coming On, L'hiver qui vient, which is not so much a translation, it's a transplantation from 19th century France to post-war England, from the French of Jules Laforgue, who was also loved by Eliot. And Eliot himself appears in a couple of lines as a kind of side reference in the poems. Interestingly enough, this poem is the only translation which appears in Philip Larkin's anthology of British verse, made, I think, in the 1980s. And it is one of the longer poems, and it is his only appearance in there, Martin Bell's. So this is towards the end of the poem. Wellingtons, long underwear, cash chemists' dreams, undrawn curtains over verandas, shores of the red brick sea of roofs and chimney pots, lampshades, tea and biscuits, all the picture papers. You'll have to be my only loves. And known them, have you? Ritual, more portentous than a sad piano's tinkling through the dusk, the registrar's returns of births and deaths in small type, weekly in the press. No, it's a time of year, and this clown of a planet. Oh, please let the wind, let the high wind unknit the bed socks. Time is knitting herself. Time of year, things tearing, time of year. Oh, let me, every year, just at this time, join in the chorus, sound the right sour note. I was just in the very first year of the art school, and Martin, I could see him once a week. when he was there. He wasn't there every week. And 5 or 6 of us, maybe 1 or 2 more, sometimes just me and one other, we'd sit there with Martin and he'd bring out copies of poems just on paper from poets, some of which I knew, but most of which I didn't know. It was a kind of introduction both to 18th century poetry, on the one hand, Alexander Pope particularly, and to contemporary poets, and not just English or American poets. He loved these sort of things, and basically he didn't take us through the poems academically. He read them, and then he sat there, and then would say something, then he'd say something. But these were slightly magical occasions for me. Martin's influence on me wasn't so much in terms of style. It was something to do with the spirit of the thing. I never did bow to the moon every night. I didn't follow him. I didn't really kind of believe in the magical parts of what he comprised. But there was something about this treatment of poetry as something both extraordinarily serious and at the same time oddly comic, not high-minded. There's nothing high-minded in Martin. His poems, his best poems, there are not very many. The 3 books that there are by him, this is the collected poems, the 1966 book, or 1967 perhaps. This is the complete poems. And this is the Penguin book. Now, the Penguin book came out roughly at the same time as the collected poems. The complete poems came out 10 years after his death, edited by Peter Porter. And a number of those other poets who were around him in the group, they include people like Peter Redgrove, like Ellen Brownjohn, like Penelope Shuttle, Ted Hughes went there a few times, and a good many others. These were part of the mood of a period of which Martin represented the most clownish, the most romantic, oddly enough, and the most kind of, how shall I say, he had no respect as such. What he had was love for things. And I think that was a very powerful message, if you like, to me, because I myself am not an academic. I never did an English degree. I didn't even do English A-level. But you read, and you fall in love with things that you read, and they become part of you. So sometimes I would go over to Martin's flat at the end because he finished up in considerable poverty, just living in 2 rooms in a boarding house. And he would ask me to read things to him. And I remember on one occasion, he said to me, "Can you bring me Alexander Pope?" And I picked out Pope, and he told me to, "Would you please read the Epistle to Dr. Arbuthnot," which a poem I highly recommend. And I started reading it, and then he just took over. He remembered. You can remember what you love, I think. So you may learn things by rote, but you can also do things out of love. And I think it was that was most powerful in Martin. And how fresh he remains. When I go back to his very best poems, and his very best poems to me, maybe 10 or a dozen. And, God knows if I might be remembered by 2 or 3. So I think that these poems are like shots of energy and a memory and a reminder rather that the life of poetry is, if you like, a kind of subversive life. I remember, and maybe I'll finish with this, and I shouldn't take this absolutely seriously, but it's worth bearing in mind. He taught English for some time in schools. That was after the war, where he served on the Italian front. And I asked him once, "Martin, what was it like teaching English in schools? What was it like especially teaching poetry?" And he kind of leaned over to me in a slightly theatrical way. And he said, "Poetry should not be taught in schools. It should be a secret and subversive pleasure." Well, of course, poetry should be taught in schools. He taught it himself. But that idea that it should be somehow secret to you, It should slightly sort of discombobulate you. It should take you somewhere beyond yourself a little. All of that, I think, I have memorized to this day. As I remember that quote, Martin in a day, Martin perhaps in a word. Well, he would be that to me, a secret and subversive pleasure. And that is a very good way to feel about poetry.